Hello everyone. Tonight's story is a particularly eerie one. The Pope who put a corpse on trial. Told softly in a British tone, it's the sort of strange tale perfect for drifting into the late hours. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us. Thank you kindly. Now, let's begin. If you enjoy these quiet historical stories, do like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always so interesting to see listeners tuning in from different parts of the world. So, dim the lights, let the fan hum softly, and allow your mind to settle as we step into this strange fragment of the past. They brought him up from the earth in the winter month, when Rome was grey and the Tiber ran swollen with rain. I was there when they opened the tomb. I stood among the silent ranks of clergy in the portico of St. Peter's, my hands folded within my sleeves, my breath visible in the cold air. The smell reached us before we saw anything, not the sharp reek you might expect, but something older, drier, like parchment left too long in damp stone, like time itself made manifest. His name was Formosus. He had been Bishop of Rome. He had crowned an emperor. He had held the keys of heaven in his mortal hands. And now, 9 months after the end of his breath, they were summoning him to answer for what he had done with them. I am old now. My eyes are weak, and my hand shakes when I hold the pen. But I remember that day as clearly as I remember my own name. I remember the sound of the spades breaking through the earth. I remember the way the bishop stepped back when the stone lid was lifted. I remember the face of Pope Stephen as he watched, his jaw set, his eyes hard with something that might have been righteousness or might have been fear. In those days, it was difficult to tell the difference. You must understand what Rome was then in the final years of the 9th century to understand why such a thing could happen. The city was not the golden seat of Christendom you might imagine. It was a battlefield dressed in sacred robes. The great basilicas still stood. Yes, St. Peter's with its columns of marble, the Lateran with its bronze doors, but they stood like monuments to a glory that was fading, replaced by something smaller, meaner, more desperate. The empire in the west had fractured. Charlemagne's grandsons had divided his realm among themselves, and now their descendants fought over the scraps. In Italy, the noble families, the Spolitan dukes, the counts of Tuscany, the Roman aristocracy, all clawed at one another for land, for titles, for the ultimate prize, control of the papacy itself. For whoever controlled the Bishop of Rome controlled the coronation of emperors, and whoever controlled the emperor controlled the future. Formosus had made a choice. In the final years of his time among us, he had turned from the Spolitans from Duke Guy and his son Lambert, whom an earlier pope had crowned emperor and sought help from the Carolingian house. He had invited Arnulf of Carinthia to Rome, had placed the imperial crown upon his head, had hoped that Frankish power might stabilize what was collapsing around us. The Spolitans did not forgive this, and when Formosus crossed the veil in April of 896, leaving the throne to his successor Boniface, who himself lasted only 15 days before his own end came, the path was clear for Stephen to ascend. Stephen, who owed his elevation to the Spolitan faction. Stephen, who had been ordained by Formosus himself but now claimed that ordination was invalid. Stephen, who needed to prove that everything his predecessor had done was tainted, corrupt, an offence against the laws of God and man. And so they brought him up from the earth. I was 31 years old that winter. I'd served in the papal administration since I was 17, when my father, a minor Roman nobleman with enough wealth to educate his sons, but not enough to guarantee their futures, secured me a position as a notary in the Scrinium, the chancery where the church's documents were drafted and sealed. I was good with words, careful with details. I knew how to turn policy into Latin that sounded like eternal truth. I knew how to make the temporary seem permanent, the convenient seem divinely ordained. I drafted bulls for 3 popes. I'd witnessed coronations and depositions. I'd seen bishops elevated and exiled, seen fortunes made and destroyed by the stroke of a pen. I thought I had seen everything the church could become when mixed with the ambitions of men. I was wrong. The trial was set for January. The place was the Lateran Basilica, the Cathedral of Rome itself, the seat from which the Bishop of Rome ruled as Christ's vicar on earth. I had walked those halls 1,000 times. I knew every column, every mosaic, every worn patch of marble where generations of pilgrims had knelt, but I had never entered them feeling what I felt that day, in the grey light of a winter morning, as the bells rang for the synod to begin. The hall was full. Bishops from across Italy had been summoned, some willingly, eager to curry favour with the new regime, others reluctantly, sensing danger but unable to refuse. The Roman clergy filled the lower ranks, and behind them stood representatives of the noble families, men whose wealth and violence were the true foundation upon which the throne of St. Peter now rested. The air smelled of incense and damp wool, of the oil burning in hundreds of lamps, of too many bodies pressed together in a space that suddenly felt too small. At the eastern end of the hall, upon the cathedra, the ancient throne from which popes had issued their judgments for 500 years, they had placed him. The earthly remains had been dressed in the full pontifical vestments, the white alb, the chasuble heavy with embroidered crosses, the pallium draped across the shoulders, the woolen band that symbolized the authority given to Peter by Christ himself. Upon his head they had placed the mitre. In his hand I saw this. I swear it upon my hope of salvation. They had placed the pastoral staff. He sat as a pope sits in judgment, but he did not move. He did not breathe. The flesh of his face had drawn tight against the bone, giving him an expression that might have been severity, or might simply have been the long rest of flesh pulling the features into stillness. His eyes were closed. His mouth was slightly open, as though he had been interrupted mid-sentence and might at any moment finish his thought. I stood in my place among the notaries, near the front where we could hear and record everything. My hands were cold despite the press of bodies. I held my writing tablet, my stylus, the tools of my profession. But I did not write. Not yet. I only looked at that still figure upon the throne and felt something inside me, some certainty I had carried all my life, begin to crack. Pope Stephen entered from the sacristy, flanked by deacons. He wore the white and gold of his office, and his face was composed, grave. He was not an old man, perhaps 40, but the months since his elevation had aged him. There were shadows beneath his eyes, and his movements had the careful control of someone balancing on the edge of something very high. He took his seat on a second throne, placed to the right of the cathedra, and the hall fell silent. Then he spoke. His voice was clear, resonant, trained to fill sacred spaces. He spoke in Latin, the language of law and liturgy, and his words were formal, correct, the language of councils and canons. But beneath the formality there was something else, something that made the incense smoke seem suddenly thicker, the lamp flames seemed to waver. He addressed the figure on the throne by name, Formosus. He called him to answer charges. He listed them, that Formosus had violated the laws of the church by accepting the papacy when he had previously been Bishop of Porto, that his ordinations were therefore invalid, that he had conspired against the rightful Emperor Lambert, that he had broken his oaths, that he had brought scandal and division upon the See of Peter. The hall was utterly quiet. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed a small choked sound. A lamp guttered. The still figure upon the throne did not move. Stephen waited, as though expecting an answer. The silence stretched. Then he turned to a young deacon standing near the cathedra, a thin man with a pale face who looked as though he might be ill. This deacon had been given a role in the proceedings. He was to speak for the accused. He was to give voice to the voiceless, to answer the charges on behalf of one who had long since ceased to breathe. Can you imagine it? Can you picture the scene? A young man, barely more than a boy, standing before the assembled bishops and nobles of Rome, speaking words he had been instructed to say, pretending to defend the vessel that once held breath, now seated upon the throne of Christ's vicar. His voice shook. He stammered. He said the words, denials, explanations, pleas for mercy, but they sounded hollow even as they left his mouth. They sounded like what they were, theatre. a performance for an audience that had already decided the verdict before the trial began. Bishop after bishop rose to testify. They spoke of Formosus's ambition, his political manoeuvring, his violations of canon law. Some of what they said was true, some was exaggeration, some was outright fabrication. It did not matter. Truth was not the point. The point was to establish that everything Formosus had done, every ordination, every appointment, every alliance was tainted, void, erased from the record of the Church as though it had never happened. And if his ordinations were void, then everyone he had ordained, priests, bishops, perhaps even Stephen himself, would need to be ordained again. The entire structure of authority, of legitimacy, of sacred succession would need to be rebuilt, reshaped, made to serve the new order. I wrote it all down. That was my task. My hand moved across the wax tablet, forming the words, recording the testimony. I was good at this work. I could write quickly, capture the essence of long speeches in concise summaries, translate the vulgar Italian of some witnesses into proper Latin. My pen made the proceedings real, gave them the weight of official record. Without me and the others like me, the trial would have been only errand memory. With us, it became history. But as I wrote, I was aware of the figure on the throne. He sat perhaps 15 feet from where I stood. If I looked up from my tablet, I could see him clearly, the careful arrangement of the vestments, the way the lamplight fell across the pale linen, the slight tilt of the head as though he were listening, considering, preparing to respond. Several times during that first day my eyes met those of other scribes, other clerks, men I had worked alongside for years. We did not speak, but I saw in their faces what I felt in my own chest. A kind of horror, yes, but also something stranger, a recognition. As though we had always known that it might come to this, that the machinery we served would eventually devour even the dead, that there was no limit to what could be justified in the name of order and legitimacy. The trial lasted 3 days. Each morning we assembled in the basilica. Each morning the earthly remains were brought from wherever they had placed them overnight. I never asked. I did not want to know, and seated again upon the throne. Each day the testimony continued, the accusations mounted, the young deacon spoke his faltering defence. On the 3rd day Stephen rose and pronounced judgment. Formosus had sinned. His papacy was declared null. His acts were void. All those he had ordained would need to receive ordination again, properly this time, from bishops whose authority was untainted. And as for the vessel itself, the physical form that had once housed the soul of a bishop, it was to be stripped of its vestments, clothed instead in the simple garb of a layman. The 3 fingers of the right hand that had been used to bless the faithful were to be severed, and the remains were to be thrown into the Tiber, cast out from sacred ground, denied even the mercy of Christian burial. They did this while we watched. The vestments were removed, the white alb, the chasuble, the pallium, all the symbols of office that had been so carefully arranged were taken away, leaving only the linen shroud in which he had originally been laid to rest. The mitre was lifted from the head. The pastoral staff was pulled from the stiffened fingers. Then came the act I can never forget, though I have tried. A deacon approached with a blade. I did not see the moment itself. I looked away, fixed my eyes on the floor, on the worn marble with its ancient patterns, but I heard the sound, a soft crack, like a green branch breaking, and then silence. When I looked up again, the figure on the throne was slumped, its right hand now incomplete, the fingers that had blessed emperors and consecrated priests lying separate upon the stone floor. They wrapped what remained in plain cloth. 4 men, not clergy, but servants hired for the task, lifted it from the throne and carried it through the basilica, out through the bronze doors into the grey January morning. The rest of us followed. A procession, but not like any I had witnessed before. There were no psalms, no chanting, just the sound of feet on stone, the rustle of robes, the distant barking of dogs in the Roman streets. At the Milvian bridge, they threw it into the river. I did not see the moment of impact. The crowd was too thick, and I was near the back. But I heard the splash, heavy and final, and then a kind of collective exhalation relief, perhaps, or horror. or simply the release of tension that had been building for 3 days. Pope Stephen stood at the front, watching until the current carried the burden away downstream toward the sea. Then he turned and walked back toward the Lateran, and the rest of us followed, and the bells began to ring as though nothing unusual had happened, as though we had not just done something that would echo through the ages. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal work. There were documents to draft, correspondence to copy, the endless administrative machinery of the church that ground forward regardless of what scandals occupied the throne. But I found I could not concentrate. My hand would stop mid-sentence. I would stare at the blank parchment before me and see instead that still figure on the throne, the careful arrangement of vestments, the empty eyes beneath the mitre. I was not alone in this disturbance. Throughout Rome, a strange mood had settled. On the streets, people spoke in whispers. In the taverns, men drank in silence. Even in the churches, the masses felt different, the words the same, but the air somehow changed, as though something invisible had shifted and we were all waiting to see what would fall. Some said it was a righteous judgment, that Formosus had indeed broken the laws of God and man, that Stephen had done what was necessary to restore order. Others said it was blasphemy, that the living had no right to judge those who had already faced the only judgment that mattered. Still others said nothing at all, but their silence was its own kind of testimony. The noble families watched and calculated. Those who had supported Formosus began to fear for their own positions. Those who had opposed him grew bold, sensing opportunity. In the Senate House, in the dim rooms where the true power of Rome was negotiated, alliances shifted like sand. I remember one evening, perhaps a week after the trial, I was walking home through the Forum. The sun was setting, painting the ruins of the old empire in shades of copper and bronze. A group of beggars had made camp among the fallen columns of the Temple of Antoninus, and their fire cast long shadows across the broken marble. One of them, an old man with milky eyes, called out to me as I passed. "The dead do not forget," he said. His voice was surprisingly strong. "They are patient, but they do not forget." I gave him a coin and hurried on, but his words followed me. They follow me still. Winter turned to spring. Rome filled with pilgrims for the Easter celebrations, and the churches were crowded with the faithful seeking forgiveness, seeking blessing, seeking some assurance that the strange events of January had not cracked the foundation of their faith. Pope Stephen performed the liturgies with careful precision, as though each gesture, each word were being weighed by invisible judges. But the city itself seemed unsettled. There were tremors in the earth's small ones, barely enough to rattle the wine cups, but frequent enough to be noticed. Some said this was natural, that Rome had always been subject to such movements. Others said it was a sign that the ground itself was rejecting what had been buried in it, or cast into its waters. In May, a fisherman pulled something from the Tiber near Ostia. Word spread quickly through the city, though the official channels tried to suppress it. A body, they said, clothed in pilgrim's garb. No one knew who it was, or how long it had been in the water, but the people whispered that it was him, that the river had given him back, that the current had carried him downstream, and then, by some miracle or curse, returned him to Rome. A small group of clergymen who had been loyal to Formosus recovered the remains and buried them quietly in a monastery outside the city walls. No ceremony, no announcement, just a hole in the ground and a prayer whispered into the darkness. Pope Stephen said nothing publicly, but those of us who worked in the Lateran noticed the change in him. He had always been intense, driven, but now there was something else, a brittleness, a constant looking over the shoulder. He increased the guard around his apartments. He stopped taking meals with the other bishops. At night, from the courtyard below, we could see the lamp burning in his window long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The summer came, and with it the heat that turns Rome into an oven. The streets stank of refuse and sweat. Fever moved through the poorer quarters, taking the weak and the young. In the basilicas, the incense could not quite mask the smell of unwashed bodies, of sickness, of fear. And then, in August, everything fell apart. It began with a riot. Some dispute in the Trastevere merchant accused a nobleman's servant of theft. Harsh words were exchanged. A crowd gathered. Such things happened often enough in those days. But this time the crowd did not disperse. It grew. It moved through the streets, gaining numbers, gaining anger, and by the time it reached the Lateran, it was no longer about a theft. It was about everything. The famine that had followed a poor harvest, the heavy taxes, the corruption of the clergy, the memory of that January trial that everyone had seen or heard about, and that no one could forget. They stormed the basilica. Not with weapons, not with organisation, just with numbers and rage. The guards tried to hold the bronze doors, but there were too few of them and too many citizens. The doors gave way. The crowd poured in. I was not there when they found Stephen. I was in the Scrinium, 2 buildings away, and by the time I understood what was happening and emerged into the courtyard, it was already over. They had dragged him from his apartments, stripped him of his vestments as he had stripped Formosus, and carried him through the streets to a prison near the Tiber. He lasted 3 days in that cell. On the 3rd day, someone no one ever admitted who entered and ensured that his end came swiftly, by command rather than by the slow method of starvation and neglect. When they pulled his vessel from the prison, there were marks upon the throat. The last order had been carried out beneath silence. They buried him without ceremony, in a common grave outside the walls. No papal funeral, no procession of bishops. The throne of Peter was vacant again, and the noble families gathered to decide who would next occupy it. In the months that followed, 3 more popes came and went. Romanus lasted 4 months. Theodore II lasted 20 days. John IX finally brought some stability, but by then the damage was done. The authority of the papacy, already weakened by decades of political interference, had been exposed as mortal, fragile, dependent not on divine mandate, but on the shifting allegiances of armed men. John IX, to his credit, tried to undo some of what Stephen had done. He held a synod that reversed the judgments against Formosus, declared his ordinations valid, condemned the trial itself as an abomination. The vessel that had been recovered from the Tiber was given proper burial in St. Peter's, and prayers were said for the repose of his soul. But you cannot unsee what has been seen. You cannot unknow what has been known. Every clerk, every bishop, every priest who had been present at that trial in January carried the memory of it, and we all knew, though we did not say it aloud, that if circumstances had been different, if the political winds had blown another direction, it would not have been Formosus on trial, but someone else. Perhaps all of us. I remained in my position for another 12 years. I drafted bulls for John IX and his successors. I witnessed the slow recovery of papal authority, the careful rebuilding of legitimacy, the gradual forgetting or pretending to forget of the events of 896 and 897. The Church is good at this, at moving forward, at covering the cracks with ceremony and tradition until they become invisible to those who are not there to see them form. But I never forgot. In quiet moments, copying a document, walking through the empty basilica in the evening, hearing the bells ring for vespers, I would remember that still figure upon the throne, the careful arrangement of vestments over the long rest of flesh, the young deacon's shaking voice, the sound of fingers breaking. I am old now, as I said. My days of service are long past. I live in a small house near the Aventine, supported by a modest pension from the church. I spend my time as old men do, sitting in the sun, feeding the birds, occasionally writing down my memories before they fade entirely. But there is one memory that will not fade, one question that has followed me through all these years. What were we judging that day in the Lateran? Was it truly Formosus and his alleged crimes? Or was it something else? Something about ourselves, about the institutions we had built, about the distance between what we claimed to be and what we actually were. I think about that throne, the ancient cathedra of Rome, upon which generations of bishops had sat to pronounce judgment on the sins of others, and I think about how, on that January day, we placed upon it not a judge but a witness. The earthly remains could not speak, could not defend, could not explain or justify or argue. It could only sit, silent and still, while we performed our theatre of righteousness around it. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps we needed someone who could not speak, could not challenge us, could not point out the contradictions and compromises that had brought us to that moment. We needed a scapegoat, but one that was already beyond suffering, beyond caring, beyond any earthly consequence, and in making the voiceless answer for our failures, perhaps we revealed more about ourselves than we ever intended. Rome is different now. The empire in the West is gone entirely, its last pretenders defeated or absorbed into the kingdoms of the Franks and Germans. The papacy has grown more powerful in some ways, more circumscribed in others. The noble families still fight for control, but the methods have changed, become more subtle, less likely to end in riots and murders in prison cells. But the basilica is the same. The throne is the same. The marble floors still bear the marks of that day, though you would not know it to look at them. Invisible traces, like so much else in Rome. The weight of history pressed into stone, readable only to those who know where to look. Sometimes, when I cannot sleep, I walk through the city at night. The streets are empty, the shops shuttered, the great buildings reduced to shadows against the stars. I walk to the Lateran and stand outside the bronze doors, looking up at the dark windows, listening to the sound of my own breathing in the silence. And I wonder, what would happen if we held another trial? If we summoned all the popes who had ever sat upon that throne, the saints and the sinners, the reformers and the corrupt, and forced them to answer for what they had done? What judgments would we pronounce? What verdicts would we record? But I know the answer. We would judge them as we judge everything, not by absolute standards of truth and justice, but by the needs of the present moment, by the demands of political expediency, by the stories we need to tell ourselves in order to sleep at night. The throne does not judge. People judge using whatever authority they can claim, whatever power they can wield. And when that authority is questioned, when that power is threatened, they will do whatever is necessary to preserve it, even if it means putting the voiceless on trial, even if it means condemning those who can no longer defend themselves. Can a throne judge itself? Can an institution examine its own foundations without discovering that they rest on sand? Can we look honestly at what we have built, without seeing the cracks, the compromises, the moments when we chose expediency over principle, power over truth? I do not know. I am not a philosopher. I was only a clerk, a man who recorded the words of others who gave them the permanence of written form. But I recorded that trial. My hand shaped those words, and in doing so, I made myself complicit in what happened. That is what I have come to understand in these final years, that there is no such thing as innocent observation, no position from which one can witness evil without being touched by it. The scribes who record the trial, the deacons who speak for the voiceless, the bishops who pronounce judgment, we are all part of the machinery, all responsible for what it produces, and yet we go on. We must go on, because the alternative to reject all authority, to tear down all institutions, to abandon the structures that hold society together, is worse, or so we tell ourselves. And perhaps it is even true, but I think we should remember what happened in that basilica. Not to condemn those who participated, I am in no position to condemn anyone, but to remind ourselves of what we are capable of when we allow fear and ambition to guide us. To remind ourselves that the distance between justice and theatre is smaller than we like to believe. To remind ourselves that the throne is only stone and wood, and the one who sits upon it is only human, and human beings are capable of terrible things when they forget this. The earthly remains of Formosus rest now in St. Peter's, where they should have remained all along. There is a marker, simple stone, with his name and the years of his papacy. Pilgrims pass it every day, most without noticing, without knowing the story it represents. But some know, some remember. And as long as one person remembers, as long as one voice speaks of what happened, the truth cannot be entirely buried. I am that voice now, though soon I will not be. Soon my vessel too will fail, will be laid in the earth, will return to the silence from which all of us came. And then another will carry the memory, or no one will, and perhaps that is as it should be. But before I crossed that veil, I wanted to set down what I saw, not to shock, not to condemn, but simply to testify, to say, this happened, this is what we did, this is what we are capable of. Let those who come after judge whether we were right or wrong. Let them examine their own institutions, their own compromises, their own moments of choosing, between what is expedient and what is true. Let them sit in judgment if they wish. But let them remember that one day they too may find themselves on trial, and the judge may be someone who has no voice, no power, no ability to answer back except with silence. That is the lesson of the throne, if there is one. That every judgment we pronounce may one day be pronounced upon us. That every trial we conduct may one day be our own. That the vessel we place in the seat of authority may one day be our vessel, and the questions we ask may be asked of us by those who care nothing for our answers. And when that day comes, when the silence is all that remains, what will we say? What defense will we offer? What mercy will we claim? I do not know. I only know that we should ask these questions now, while we still have breath to answer them, before the earth receives us, before the river carries us away, before we become, like Formosus, nothing more than a name on stone and a story told in whispers. The bells are ringing now. It must be Vespers. The sun is setting over Rome, painting the ruins and the churches in the same golden light, making no distinction between what was and what is, between the sacred and the profane. In this light, everything looks beautiful, everything looks forgiven. But I know better. I've seen what happens when forgiveness is confused with forgetting, when beauty is used to cover ugliness, when silence is mistaken for peace. The throne sits empty in the basilica, or perhaps it is occupied by ghosts, by memories, by the weight of all the judgments that have been pronounced from it over the centuries. Who can say? Who dares to look too closely? I have looked, I have seen, and now I have spoken. That is all any witness can do. That is all any of us can do in the end. The rest is silence.